Hi, Robert here with another episode of Mastering Python. In this video, I will show you how you can pass self to the constructor of another class and still take advantage of static type checking. You will learn how to implement and use protocol classes by improving the app further that we created in the last video. So if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please consider doing this now, so you guys can keep up to date with all of our videos. So you know what? Let's get to it! Alright, I've already opened the Python app that we created in the last video, in which we wrapped Flask in a class, and in which we created an endpoint named Hello World with this class method. In this video, we will create a unique class for this endpoint, and we will pass self, which is Flask OOP in our case, to the constructor of this new endpoint class. I will show you how to do this while keeping static type checking in place. So first I create a new Python file that contains a unique class for this Hello World endpoint. In this new endpoint Hello World file, I define this new class as follows. Class endpoint Hello World with this constructor that sets the class properties route, endpoint, callback function and methods. We've created this Hello World function in the app.py file in the previous video, so we simply move it here. We cut the Hello World function and we move it to the endpoint class. Next we create a new function here, def register endpoint. Then we switch back to the app.py file again and we cut and paste this Flask add URL rule function call to the register endpoint method in the endpoint.helloworld file. But we replace these parameters here with the properties that we defined in the constructor. But note, the Flask app that is stored in the app property of the Flask OOP class here doesn't exist in our endpoint class. Therefore, we will try to pass the Flask OOP class to the constructor of this endpoint Hello World class. For this purpose, we switch back to the app.py file, and here we go to the register endpoints method, where we now instantiate the endpoint Hello World class, and we then call its register endpoint method. However, in order to be able to instantiate this endpoint Hello World class, we first have to import it at the top of this file. When we instantiate this endpoint Hello World class, we now will try to pass self. Self represents the class we are currently in, which is Flask OOP in our case. Then we switch to the endpoint Hello World file, and here we add the Flask OOP class to the constructor. Flask OOP of type Flask OOP. Again, this file doesn't know this type here, so we have to import it at the top of this file. Now we can try to store the Flask OOP object, which is of type Flask OOP and that was passed in the constructor, in a class variable of the endpoint Hello World class. Then we can take this Flask OOP variable and use it in the register endpoint function as follows. Self.flaskOOP.app, which now contains the Flask app, and here we can call the add URL rule function of the Flask app. But does this actually work? Let's try out. In the terminal window we activate our virtual environment and then we run python app.py. And we receive this import error, cannot import from partially initialized module, most likely due to a circular import. This means that Python doesn't allow us to import this class that we pass to our constructor here. So we could try to deactivate this import statement. However, this class wouldn't be recognized here and we would lose the ability to do a static type checking if we would remove it. That's where protocol classes comes into play and maybe can help us. So what we will do now is to create a protocol class for this Flask OOP class. So I create a new file appstub.py, which contains a class flask_OOP_stub. Of course you can name this as you like. However, of course it's easier to remember if it's somehow related to the initial class in the app.py file here. Please note that a custom protocol class has to be derived from the protocol class. And in order to be able to do this, we have to import the protocol class from the typing module. A protocol class can be compared to interfaces in other programming languages. So we can define the properties of the original class here. So for example, the app property refers to the app property in the app.py file, which contains our Flask app. However, as with interfaces, we don't have to implement it here. Instead, we simply can type these 3 dots here. Additionally, we are free to define just those properties and methods here that we actually need. So in our use case, we are fine if we just define the app property here. Then we switch back to the endpoint hello world file, and instead of importing Flask OOP from the app file, we now import the Flask OOP_stub protocol class from the app_stub file. And in the constructor, we can replace the Flask OOP class with the Flask OOP_stub class. Now we can safely access the Flask app here in the register endpoint method, since the Flask OOP object is of type Flask OOP_stub now. But now let's check it out if this approach works indeed. I clear the terminal window and I run the app again. This time it runs without any error messages, so we can press Ctrl and click on the URL here, which opens the endpoint in the browser. So that's all for today. If you like this content, please click the like button, the subscribe button and the notification bell below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.